Welcome, foolish mortals, to the Haunted Mansion.
I am your host, your ghost host. Kindly step all the way in, please, and make room for everyone. There's no turning back now. Our tour begins here in this gallery, where you will see cinematic interpretations of one of the world's most beloved attractions in all of theme park history. Hello, happy haunts. As you may or may not know, the Haunted Mansion is one of the world's most popular and beloved theme park attractions, spawning its initial incarnation in Disneyland, California, and my favorite rendition located in Orlando, Florida at the Magic Kingdom in Walt Disney World. The Haunted Mansion is a dark ride, that being a ride with seat cars on a slow-moving conveyor belt that takes you through staged scenes and spaces filled with ideally immersive sounds, animatronics, practical effects, smells, the whole works. The Haunted Mansion in particular takes you on a tour through a haunted house where a friendly ghost host tries to encourage you to join their 999 happy haunts, and that he's looking for a volunteer to make it 1,000. Additionally, this ride, in 2003, similar to Pirates of the Caribbean, has spawned a film adaptation. According to its Wikipedia article, this film was an American supernatural horror comedy film. This is a questionable description of the film, but we'll get into that later. The 2003 film is widely regarded as a flop, receiving some of the worst reviews and Rotten Tomatoes scores I have ever seen. In this hellscape we call 2023, we have just received another film adaptation of this beloved ghostly romp. While the trailers for this new take on a film adaptation of the Haunted Mansion definitely seemed more promising than the attempt 2 decades prior, this may or may not turn out to be the case. Today, I would like to take a dive into the history of the attraction, the purpose and reasoning behind trying to craft a film adaptation in the first place, take a look at what the 2003 film did wrong that has given it such a ghoulish legacy, and take a look at the 2023 film adaptation and where it has succeeded or failed in comparison to its original namesake, as well as its 2003 predecessor. Well, let's get spooky. Part 1. Origins of the Haunted Mansion. Our story begins in the 1950s when a visionary Disney legend, Harper Goff, sketched an intriguing concept. A rundown building atop a hill casting a shadow over Main Street, USA. Collaborating with fellow Imagineer Ken Anderson, the idea of a haunted building nestled in New Orleans Square was born. Walt Disney himself was deeply fascinated by the concept. As a matter of fact, a haunted house has always been in the plans for Disneyland back in the earliest iterations of the park. Check out Defunctland's great video on that vision for the park below. However, Walt didn't want a decaying building in the heart of his meticulously designed theme park. So, the winning aesthetic for an exterior design ended up being the opulent prestige of Southern Manners in New Orleans, a perfect fit for the Liberty Square section of the Magic Kingdom. The Haunted Mansion attraction underwent several concept changes before its facade was completed in 1963, 6 years prior to its public opening. This was delayed due to the fact that Disney was involved in the 1964 New York World's Fair. Initially, the idea was for it to be a walkthrough experience. Conceptual drawings were created for this concept, but eventually this was abandoned in favor of transforming the attraction into a ride-through experience. On August 9th, 1969, the attraction officially opened to the public in Disneyland, California, and has remained since largely unchanged. The Magic Kingdom version of the Haunted Mansion was developed simultaneously with the Disneyland counterpart, with both attractions opening within a 2-year time frame. This parallel development process resulted in the creation of 2 sets of every figure, prop, scenic element, and all that good jazz except for a few Florida exclusive items like the library and the music room. Thanks to this dual development effort, the Magic Kingdom's Haunted Mansion became the first attraction to reach completion in the Magic Kingdom. Sometime in the 90s, cast members and guests had created their own history and canon for the house and compiled these stories onto a website known as the Ghost Gallery. In some cases, this influenced the canon of the Haunted Mansion. In order to adequately examine what the 2003 film did wrong and whether or not the 2023 film did any better, we'll need to know what we're working with for source material. Part 2. Lore of the Haunted Mansion. The Haunted Mansion takes guests on a tour of the ghostly grounds, and it's led by your very own ghost host. The experience begins before even entering the building, as the queue also nods to some of the mansion's residents, including the debated owner, Master Gracie. The ghost host is the narrator of the Haunted Mansion. He's a seemingly friendly, disembodied spirit who speaks in a deep voice with a transatlantic accent. His history is mostly shrouded in mystery, but it is known that he died by being hanged in the mansion. Towards the beginning of the ride, he says that there's no way to get out of the mansion, but that there's always my way. With lightning striking and a silhouette of a hanged man appearing above the entry room, the implication being that he took his own life by suicide, hanging himself to escape the mansion. Master Gracie's tombstone was one of the original tombstones installed in the family plot of the Haunted Mansions in the Magic Kingdom in Disneyland as a tribute to Imagineer Yale Gracie, who was responsible for practically all of the illusions found within the ride. The tombstone became associated with a portrait in the foyer of the Haunted Mansion at the Magic Kingdom. The painting is a special effect that shows a young man transforming into a skeleton. The interpretation of the character of Master Gracie was a fan and cast-made theory as part of the Ghost Gallery. The unofficial backstory of Master Gracie here also conflated him with the character of the Ghost Host, so any framing around Master Gracie is to be taken with a grain of salt. The Haunted Mansion also features the spectral presence of the Ghost Bride. In a previous iteration of the Haunted Mansion conceived by Ken Anderson, the bride played a prominent and recurring role. Her haunting tale unfolded as she discovered her husband's dark past as a notorious pirate, which instilled fear within her. Tragically, in an act of retaliation, the captain ended her life. Constance Hatchaway is one of the ghosts within the Haunted Mansion if you buy into the Ghost Gallery. She's really the only openly hostile seeming ghost on the ride. She's the reimagined version of the original bride character that was introduced in 2006, and the attic that she can be found in was also redesigned around her to reflect this new nefarious widow interpretation of her. While her full backstory isn't clear, many details are revealed implicitly during the attic scene. Constance, Connie if you will, was a beautiful wealth-seeking social climber. She accomplished this by marrying several rich men. However, each was murdered after the wedding, decapitated with a hatchet so that she could claim their fortunes. Interestingly, this also closely reflects the tale of Bluebeard, except with the bride killing her recent husbands instead of the Pirate King killing his young brides. The bride is seen again on your way out of the ride. She's seen up above the death buggies with a glowing red bleeding heart. She's chanting either, hurry back, or you'll be back, as you pull out of the mansion. My research for this video says the prior, but I always heard, and there's a reference in the new movie to the you'll be back interpretation, so we're gonna go with the latter, you'll be back. Before I move on to the last major character of the ride, I do feel like I should explain some of this Bluebeard stuff. Basically, there's this classic horror tale called Bluebeard where a pirate king keeps killing his young brides and hanging them up in a murder room. He marries his 7th young bride, leaves her alone while he goes on a trip, and said, here's a key that opens literally every door in the house. You can go in any room except for that one particular room. And of course, it's the room with all the hanged brides in it. So of course, she gets curious and ends up going in. She's super shocked and screams and drops the key and then realizes that the key in her hands are covered in like red paint or blood or something. And she tries to get it off, but she can't. It's like magically enchanted or whatever. So when he comes back, he sees this all over her hands and the key and tries to kill her too. She, however, outsmarts him, stalls, and waits for help to come, and then Bluebeard gets ousted. The reason that this is relevant is that the original plot of the ride was very heavily inspired by Bluebeard once it actually got into Imagineering. While the overarching plot of Bluebeard was abandoned in the final lore of the manor, there's a large memorial/gravestone on your way out of the ride for Bluebeard and his 7 wives. At the top of the stone, it reads Bluebeard, and then his first 6 wives are listed out in order with death dates listed. Finally, Lucretia is listed under them, no death date included. Below their names, it reads 7 winsome wives. Some fat, some thin, 6 of them were faithful, but the 7th did him in. This, of course, being a line from the original tale. Fake news, patriarchy, not a good look. Haunted Mansion. Anyways, the presence of the Bluebeard thing here is obviously meant to reflect the overall theming of widowing into wealth. The last owner of the mansion is implied to be Constance Hatchaway's last husband because she stopped once she got that MILF money, honey. I guess the last leg of her life spent not murdering people didn't do her much good, though, because she still got left haunting the mansion for the rest of her ghostly days. The last really prominent character of the ride is Madame Leota. Madame Leota is the ghost of a psychic medium residing in the haunted mansion, manifesting as a disembodied head inside a misty crystal ball. In all versions of the attraction, Madame Leota can be found in the center of some room, chanting a spell that conjures the spirits of the mansion so that the guests can see the ghosts. Musical instruments and other objects levitate in the shadows as part of her spell. She is able to summon the ghosts from the spirit world to meet the guests of the mansion. How hospitable of her. In the Liberty Square Mansion's family plot, Madame Leota is given a tombstone. This tombstone implies Madame Leota was close to the family which owned the mansion. There's a shop next to the attraction called Memento Mori, which is implied to have been Madame Leota's home from back when she was alive. She is said to have been a witch who fled from Salem during the infamous witch trials, which would mean that Madame Leota would have been alive sometime during the 1690s. Other minor characters and details of the ride include, but are not limited to, a ton of graves from family members and those close to the residents of the manor. Most of these appear to be jokes and do not seem to have any serious connection to any other lore in the mansion. The 4 paintings in the stretching room are a bearded gentleman holding a document who is revealed to only be wearing his undergarments from the waist down and standing atop a lit keg of dynamite. A pretty young lady who is holding a parasol is revealed to be balancing on a fraying tightrope above the gaping jaws of an alligator. An old woman who is holding a rose is revealed to be sitting atop a tall gravestone, at the bottom of which is a stone bust of her husband George with a hatchet embedded in his head. A man in a bowler hat is revealed to be sitting on the shoulders of another man who is sitting on the shoulders of a third man who is waist deep in quicksand. There are marble busts of the greatest ghost riders the world has ever known. These are busts in the library that appear to turn their heads to follow you as you move through the ride. It's a really cool optical illusion. There's a ghost playing the piano in the room after the library. A trippy staircase room full of Penrose stairs. Spectral footsteps can be seen walking up and down these stairs. The wallpaper that is covered in bat-like skeleton key sort of things appear to have moving/glowing eyes in the darker corners of the mansion. A raven is sitting by a grave where an animated corpse is trying to claw their way out. A grandfather clock that is stuck on 13 has a large shadow of a claw passing over it over and over again. There's a grand dining/ballroom in which ghostly guests enjoy a feast and a ballroom dance in circles. There's an organist who is ostensibly different than the pianist earlier, who is playing the organ with spirits flowing out the top of the organ. An attic that contains most of the details regarding good old Connie includes a wedding cake and some changing portraits of her with her late husbands. A groundskeeper and his dog that appear as though they are unambiguously maybe alive. They don't look non-corporeal at all as far as the effects go. There's a 4-piece ghost band playing the music of grim grinning ghosts. A 5-man a cappella group of busts animated by spirits is singing the vocals of grim grinning ghosts, one of whom is knocked off of his bust right at the neck. An opera singer who's being choked out using her own braid by another ghost. Of course, the hitchhiking ghosts, which are one of the most shilled pieces of the rides. That doesn't mean to say that it's a bad thing, it's just, like, they're barely in the ride and they're not super important, but, they're on, so much of the merch, and they're a big deal in the movie. Then, once again, at the end of the ride, there's a raven, another aberration of the bride, chanting, as we said earlier, "You'll be back." So, that's most of what you need to know about the ride to have the context on what we're working with for source material. So, it's time to examine what went wrong with the 2003 Haunted Mansion film. Part 3. The Haunted Mansion 2003. What went wrong? So this movie fails on all fronts, and I know that sounds like a really strong statement, but let's take a look back to the beginning of this video for a second. The Wikipedia article for this film dubs it to be a horror comedy film that is based on the theme park attraction of the same name. So based on this description, we have 4 merits on which to judge the film's success or failure, at least if we're trying to judge it on the basis of what it is attempting to do. So those 4 merits, those 4 bases of judgment are: first, a horror; second, a comedy; third, as an adaptation of the ride; and fourth, as a film, i.e. analyzing its fundamental value as a vessel for storytelling. So, I propose we go down this list one by one. First though, I'll give you a synopsis of the film so that you have any idea what I'm talking about without having to go and watch this monstrosity, which I had to do several times for this video, and it was just a miserable experience. Alright, so the film opens on Jim Evers, a real estate agent played by Eddie Murphy, attempting to sell a home to a bickering couple. The endeavor almost fails until his wife and real estate partner Sarah Evers calls, and he's able to fake a conversation with another prospective buyer to get them to purchase the home in spite of their doubts and squabbling. In spite of it being his anniversary, Jim works late into the night after being easily pushed around by clients. He returns home late to an angry wife to shower her in gifts to try and curb her reaction to his lack of consideration. In spite of being his real estate partner and business partner and otherwise seeming to be very into doing the business with him 5 seconds ago in the film, she's pissed and starts throwing other past work-life balance transgressions in his face. He attempts to fix this by promising a spontaneous weekend lake trip with her and their 2 children. Prior to leaving on their trip, they get a call to make a real estate opportunity stop on the way out to the lake. Sarah begrudgingly agrees to this as it seems like a good business venture. The only other important thing that happens during the house scene is that Eddie Murphy tries to get his son to kill a spider, and the son won't do it because he's a big scaredy baby. So they pull their car up to an obviously ominous and rundown manor in the middle of nowhere on a barely usable road. And the gate is locked and no one is there, because of course it is. And as they're about to leave, of course, the gate opens. So they examine the grounds, which for some reason has an entire graveyard on it. Not suspicious at all. So upon entering the house, they are greeted by the butler, Ramsley, who I can only describe as a man you would expect to either warn you off of or lull you into the plot of a Stephen King film. It's giving very
sometimes dad is better.
Alright, so he greets them, confirms that Sarah is in fact Sarah, and tells Eddie Murphy that he wasn't expecting you. Odd. You invited him. Alright, so they're introduced to the master of the manor, Edward Gracie, and are coaxed into a grand dinner with them. They are then stranded in this increasingly uncomfortable situation by inclement weather making the road completely unusable. They are forced to spend the night, and Evers and Evers Real Estate adjourn to their room to continue their petty squabbling, which results in Sarah storming off and the family getting separated. Eddie Murphy is lulled into a room by himself by Ransley, who subsequently abandons him to run into a bunch of horrifying haunted mansion light spooky special effects. The kids venture around the house and run into some Tweedledee Tweedledum ghosts that keep almost telling them too much information. And Sarah goes off with Edward Gracie to put the final nail in the coffin of her characterization, as she serves as merely a blank canvas for him to exposition dump on between scenes with other characters for the rest of the film. Some of the important pieces of exposition that he drops are that he has a dead fiancée named Elizabeth who he misses a whole awful lot, and that she's dead, and that he's very sad about it. Eddie Murphy, his children, and Ghostly D and Spooky Dumb run into Madame Leota, who sends them on a fetch quest. After delivering the same exposition to them that Sarah is also receiving in alternating scenes. The fetch quest goes off mostly without a hitch, other than them almost dying very briefly for no other reason other than that Eddie Murphy's son is just really afraid of spiders and almost let his family die because of it, so, great. Oh yeah, we also get a stupid Sixth Sense reference here in this graveyard, it's awful. So, Madame Leota leads the family to a trunk in the attic where Jim finds an old letter from Elizabeth to Edward with the premise of marriage, revealing that her suicide was false. Ramsley appears and reveals himself to be the villain of the film. Big shock, I know. And that he murdered Elizabeth to prevent Gracie from marrying a black woman. Ramsley is cancelled. Alright, so he puts the children inside of a trunk and then literally throws Jim out of the mansion and casts some spell to keep him from re-entering. Gracie and Sarah come to the ballroom, and Gracie gets impatient with Sarah not remembering being Elizabeth and starts yelling at her and chasing her through the house. Sarah insists that she is in fact not Elizabeth, but Gracie continues to persist. Ramsley strong-arms Elizabeth into going through with this whole weird shotgun wedding by threatening death to her children. They start doing a wedding ceremony that will lead Sarah to die by poison and become a ghost so that she and Gracie can be together. Jim and Leota drive a car into the side of the mansion. It's very Chamber of Secrets. Jim gives the letter to Master Gracie, revealing to him the truth about Elizabeth's death and that Ramsley had lied to him about it for all those years. Master Gracie is understandably peeved. Ramsley summons wraiths to kill the group, but a fiery dragon emerges from the fireplace during the chaos and drags Ramsley down to the pits of hell where his racist ass belongs. Ramsley grabs Jim and tries to pull him down with him for ruining his plans, but Master Gracie rescues Jim and the two watch as Ramsley falls through into the fiery pits. So Sarah sort of dies, but this floating ghost ball that's been around for a lot of the film arrives and possesses her body, revealing itself to have been Elizabeth's ghost. Elizabeth and Master Gracie kiss using Sarah's body, which is weird that they needed to do that because Master Gracie is a ghost, but it's fine. And then Sarah is revived as the two of them return to being ghosts. In gratitude and seeking redemption, Master Gracie gifts the Evers the deed to the house, allowing them to do whatever they want with it as long as they remain happy. The ghosts all depart the mansion and move on to heaven, presumably based on the context of the movie. The film ends with the Evers driving off for a proper vacation, accompanied by Madame Leota and the four singing busts, and they end the film by singing their own rendition of When the Saints Go Marching. Alright, so let's get into this. So, as a theatrical release PG-rated Disney comedy film, the method on which this should succeed the most is as a comedy, right? And somehow, in my opinion, it fails to do this most of all. In spite of casting Eddie Murphy in the lead role, assumingly for his comedy chops, they've given him almost no real functional punchlines. The primary issue here is that they have him openly cracking jokes in what is otherwise a pretty somber and dramatic story. Of course, the character himself is supposed to be a sort of like stuffy, fake person real estate agent, but the issue is that when you stick him in the middle of all these straight man characters who are completely unamused by his constant cringy real estate dad humor, it just doesn't land. So his comedy is tonally dissonant with everything else that is going on around him, and none of the other characters seem to find him particularly funny or cringy, but not in that way that we're supposed to be able to agree with them from a third-person perspective. They just simply often roll their eyes or don't laugh and almost seem to completely fail to acknowledge he said anything at all. So the most egregious example of this is towards the beginning of the film when they are entering the mansion for the first time. I think that this is supposed to be a joke for the parents watching the movie, but the character Eddie Murphy is playing is also, I think, supposed to be making a joke in character, at least the way I assume it was written in the screenplay. And if he's not, it's just incredibly poorly written dialogue, because, like, who talks like this? Anyways, just watch the joke. Here it is.
All right, you kids know when you're at work with mommy and daddy, always on your best behavior, right? Okay. Whew. Look at the size of these knockers. Ever seen anything like that before?
So I think the way that this was written in the script must have been with the intention of a tension-breaking joke. But Eddie Murphy delivered it in a way that was consistent with the tone of the scene, which means he delivered it straight. But this leaves us with a problem. Eddie Murphy is a comedy actor, and that's why he's cast here. He has this, like, goofy persona to his voice pretty organically, which is why he worked so well as, like, Donkey in the Shrek films. So if this had been delivered as a joke properly in character, it would have given the actress playing Sarah an opportunity to lampshade the joke for the parents by giving him an accusatory look and rolling her eyes or sighing or whatever, while allowing the kids to laugh at the goofy way Eddie Murphy talks and at, like, haha, the grown-up adult married people are, like, at each other's throats in a funny way, you know? So instead, none of this was done, and the line was delivered straight, and if the line was meant to be delivered straight, then again, this is just, like, inexcusably poorly written dialogue. This issue exists to an even further degree with the other minor roles in the film. Specifically, the two ghosts that meet up with the children in the attic are both comedy actors. I don't know much about Dinah Spivey, the actress who plays the maid, but based on her credits on Wikipedia, I would have to assume that she has at least some comedy chops. However, I do know that they have comedy powerhouses, Wallace Shawn as the footman ghost and Jennifer Tilly as Madame Leota. Wallace Shawn is just completely wasted here. He's being forced into this weird humor with the maid that's supposed to be based in their bickering, but again, the tone and delivery that is the backdrop for these moments are just completely not played for laughs. And so anything that might have a chance to be funny, like Wallace Shawn saying,
"Trespassers don't get cookies,"
doesn't get an opportunity to be. The only comedy in this film that's not completely wasted, and the only person who got a single laugh out of me like the entire film, was Jennifer Tilly. She's firing on all cylinders here, and unfortunately she's been mostly relegated to like regurgitating exposition and references to the ride, which in and of itself is a bigger issue that we will get into later. Alright, so the movie fails as a comedy. Let's examine it as a horror now. Unsurprisingly, it fails on this front almost as badly as it fails on the comedy portion. The same issues that plague it as a comedy plague it here. At times when they should be breaking the horror filmmaking cliches to make way for a joke, they continue to apply them. For example, the joke that I cited earlier that Wallace Shawn says,
"Trespassers don't get cookies."
but there's this anxiety-inducing music being played over it the whole time, as the children are implied to be in like mortal danger. On the other hand, there are some action-oriented moments during the movie that could use a much heavier hand to try and establish them as horror shots. For example, when they head down into the tomb to retrieve the key Madame Leota sends them for, Jim and the kids are tromping through a graveyard immediately after what was intended to be one of the most high comedy moments of the film, I think. They undercut what would obviously be a great setting for a horror scene, a graveyard, at night.
At night.
By giving us absolutely no horror-oriented cues at all, and very harshly lighting the characters in what looks to be like cool fluorescent lighting coming from like just off to the left of the cameras. They then use this moment to instead try and make a cheap toilet humor joke by playing the most egregious post-production sound effect of stepping in mud and having Jim be grossed out.
He's broke, dead, and cursed. Nice move.
And then, as though this weren't bad enough, they have his son do it immediately after and play the exact same sound effect.
Hey kids, watch your step.
Oh, crap.
Hey, Michael, don't say crap.
They don't even pitch shift the sound effect at all. There is one sparse moment in this film that I would say succeeds at its horror aspects, and I do want to give credit where credit is due. The reason I put succeeds in air quotes is that this moment is at the very end of a film that I was otherwise unable to achieve any suspension of disbelief for, and it is the very climax of the movie. While this individual scene is perfectly serviceable, movies are not simply a sum of isolated scenes. They have to be assessed in context, and the context leading up to this moment is just simply kneecapping it. Anyways, the soundtracking at this moment is right, the lighting and visual cues are right, the CGI is perfectly serviceable for 2003, almost all of the actors are doing the right thing here, and you get a serious sense of tension when Jim and Sarah almost die at certain points. If the rest of the film had been even passable as a horror movie, this scene would be pretty effective. Unfortunately, it hasn't, so it isn't. Another credit where credit is due thing, Ramsley's actor, Terrence Stamp, is honestly doing a great job here with the role that he was given, which is to be the primary horror of the film, but everything that's always going on around him at any given moment is just all wrong and tonally dissonant, and makes his otherwise great performance just completely impotent in context. The next piece of the puzzle that the movie fails at is to be a film adaptation of the Haunted Mansion attraction. I feel as though there were two ways that a movie could succeed as an adaptation of the ride, and these are going to be important for a later discussion, so I'm going to describe them now. The first is that the ride has a lore and a story that we described earlier, and one way to succeed as an adaptation would be to completely translate the lore and story of the Haunted Mansion ride into a film script that follows that same plot with those same characters. Just the same way that you would like adapt a book into a screenplay. I do think that this is the weaker position to approach this concept from, even though it is the more obvious one. The reason for this is that, as we discussed earlier, the actual lore and plot of the Haunted Mansion are fairly loose, and a lot of the most accepted canon are things that cast members and fans did to fill in the blanks that the ride leaves. This means that the literally adapting the plot track would prove treacherous, as the screenwriter would have to decide between skimming ideas from fan/cast member works and try to keep consistent with common fan expectation for what the plot of the movie would be, or work with what is literally in the ride and any Imagineer notes that may have been archived, and then work to fill in the gaps and create a coherent plot from there. And this movie chose to do both. They pick some disparate and incoherent pieces from the Ghost Gallery and try and cobble them together with some things from the ride, and then fill in a lot of blanks or twist what they pulled from the Ghost Gallery, I assume to avoid some kind of lawsuit since those ideas are documented as having belonged to cast and fans. The results are just staggering if you try and analyze this plot, which we'll do shortly. The second way that this movie could have succeeded as an adaptation of the ride is by consistently evoking an aesthetic quality that gives you the same feeling as riding the ride and reminds you of things that you may remember from the ride. For a relative superfan like myself, and I'm using that term loosely, you can count on them knowing some little details here and there from the ride and rely on those things to convey the feelings of the ride. For the average viewer though, they've probably been to some form of the Haunted Mansion 1 to like 3 or 4 times in their life, so you've got to really drive home the aesthetic qualities of the ride in order to succeed in this aspect, and to execute them not just literally but also qualitatively, as you're going to be relying on the emotional memory of having ridden the ride, which they may have done very few times and also potentially a long time ago. This is where the movie fails horribly. So while it is littered with references to the ride, these references are done literally rather than aesthetically. For instance, the singing busts are present on their way out to the tomb, and they are literally acting pretty accurately to how they're presented in the ride. However, they completely fail to affect the same feeling as they do in the ride. They're being forced to interact with Eddie Murphy by annoyingly singing over him while they have Eddie fucking Murphy trying to play the straight man in the scene, all the while maintaining his frenetic, high-energy speech patterns. Additionally, because the bust scene happens just after the terrible toilet humor scene, it carries a lot of the same artificial, dissonant energy. The singing busts in the ride are in this like indoor-outdoor space of the gardens toward the end of the ride. They're lit in this dark, ominous blue lighting, staying in tune with the tone of the ride, while supporting the jovial, celebratory nature that they often depict the happy haunts having. Like, it's all like a party out there, and these are the lead singers, you know? This is just a complete failure to take in an aesthetic entertainment experience and to try and plausibly transform it into another medium in a way that goes beyond just putting an 8th grader's description of what happens in the scene based on only reading a SparkNotes page about it directly into the stage directions. It also fails in this regard because every time they make a reference to the ride, the film grinds to a halt. The singing busts are also a good example of this, but Madame Leota, in spite of her good portrayal by Jennifer Tilly, is also a good example of this. Jim encounters Madame Leota, and we get an entire scene of her moving instruments around the room and doing some weird slapstick comedy with Eddie Murphy in a floating chair. This goes on for almost 2 minutes in a film with a 90-minute runtime and leads to no plot development, does not characterize Madame Leota in a way that she's portrayed in the ride or for the rest of the film, and is another dissonant moment where the film can't decide if it wants to prioritize horror or comedy either as a film or in an individual scene. She continues to recite lines from the ride throughout the movie, but every time they're just references to the ride that fail to adequately answer other characters' questions, and so she always ends up re-explaining herself anyways, meaning that all the reference to the ride did was slow the pacing. An adaptation, and I feel crazy that I have to say this, an adaptation should not have its pacing bogged down by any and all attempts to make the thing resemble the source material. If that's happening, you should really reassess if you want to be doing an adaptation at all. Lastly, I would like to point out that the lighting and sound aesthetics from the ride are just nowhere to be found in this movie. The ride is full of these harsh purples and greens and blues, evoking an almost cartoonish ideal of what it means to be a ghost, all these cool colors. The closest thing that we get to this color palette is Madame Leota, and then sort of the colors of the ghosts when they're in their non-corporeal state, but that might be feeling that way just because the rest of the color palette around them is so drab. I'm pretty sure that they're also a fairly desaturated blue. So I think that at this point we can pretty quickly answer the fourth metric on which you could possibly judge this film, whether or not it was a successful vessel in a cinematic medium for delivering a compelling, coherent story or a statement of theme. No, obviously not. However, there are a few ways in which I would like to point out that this film fails at this, i.e. just storytelling in general. All right, so the characterization of Sarah is just like incredibly inconsistent. I alluded to this briefly earlier, but in the very first scene of the film, we see her calling her husband and excitedly playing along with his hardball business strategies and being jovial and playful. By the time he gets home that night, she is an entirely different person. And yes, I know that she's angry justifiably with him for missing their anniversary dinner, but they're business partners and his success is her success, and she understands the business, and it just seems so contrary to how we, the viewers, just finished seeing her. Once they're in the mansion, she goes on to start blaming him for like the weather and just picking a fight with him for basically like no reason, things that are entirely out of his control at that point, and then ends up just acting as like this like doe-eyed exposition wall for the rest of the film after that. So great, we're empowering Black women. This entire film essentially serves through both explicit and implicit means to convey like one plot idea or like plot point to the audience, and they just take forever to get to it because they have to establish like the Evers and make them our point of view characters. So the mansion is full of ghosts who are all doomed to spend eternity as ghosts unless Gracie can kill and then marry Sarah in that order, and Ramsley is determined to make that happen because of reasons. And that's the entire plot. That is the entire plot of the film. Like, nothing else happens. Like, you can talk about the Evers and stuff, but really, like, the stuff that goes on with them as a family is not what the movie's about. It's an adaptation of the Haunted Mansions, and, like, so the stuff going on with the Haunted Mansion is the plot. The Evers are just, like, point of view characters, and they're bad ones at that. So, yeah, there's really nothing here. Lastly, this is just a really poorly made film, and I don't feign to be a filmmaker, but I don't think that I have to be that in order to give my opinion on something. So watching The Haunted Mansion for this video was excruciating, and I'm going to exemplify why for you with just a quick clip, and I feel like it's going to make everything just excruciatingly clear.
In the first place, we weren't even supposed to be here. We were supposed to be at the lake.
Hey, what am I supposed to do? Control the weather now, Sarah?
That's not the point. You couldn't resist. You just had to come.
Excuse me, this is a big opportunity for all of us.
Not for us, for you. The only thing you seem to care about anymore is work.
Oh, but when I'm working hard like this, it doesn't matter as long as I'm bringing you home expensive gifts, right?
All right, so that's it, right? Like, it's a bad movie. So these characters are placed in an uninteresting space, somehow both turned away from the camera. The sound mixing does not highlight what we're supposed to be paying attention to at all. And even if they manage with this ridiculously wide shot that should really be zoomed up close on the interpersonal interactions rather than showing you the entire drab, uninteresting space with a samey color palette, you have no reason from before this or what you're expecting after to hope anything happens to either of these annoying, petulant people, short of the mansion catching on fire so the movie can be over sooner. Alright, so that's The Haunted Mansion 2003. So when I say it failed on all fronts, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And I really hope that you don't feel like I went in too hard on that film. If you do, go watch it. Go watch it. It's really bad. But it's the year of our Dark Lord Satan, 2023, and we have knowledge. And knowledge is power. So let's see if 20 years in the cinematic grave did this attraction any good for getting a film adaptation. Part 4, The Haunted Mansion 2023. This time, it's personal. So since this movie literally just came out, I am going to go ahead and not just explain the whole plot of the film to you, especially because this one actually has a plot, and so it would take a lot longer to explain. So I'm going to focus mainly here on analyzing the film in the same 4 categories as the last part, that being its successes and or failures as a comedy, a horror, an adaptation of the ride, and as a film, i.e. a vessel for storytelling in the cinematic format. I'll bring up plot relevant details where they're necessary. I'm not going to completely avoid it, but you might want to go catch the movie first if you're a particularly spoiler-averse person. Otherwise, stay on board this Doom buggy and let's see if this Haunted Mansion did its job. 2 more quick notes before I jump into this. One is that while this film did technically have a $150 million budget, while the 2003 film only had a $90 million budget, if you account for inflation in a really basic way, and I want to make it clear that I don't know if, like with filmmaking, that a flat inflation calculation like this really applies. The films functionally had the same budget. if you look at this calculation. The second thing I'd like to mention is that the 2023 film was released as a PG-13 rating. I think that this gives it a bit more room to work in both terms of horror and comedy without feeling restricted to not be too scary for kids and to not make jokes that they want to make. And there's no way in 2003 that Disney would have let an adaptation of The Haunted Mansion get out the gates with anything above a PG rating. So this film did have a leg up in that regard. All right. In order to keep this structure parallel and keep this review and analysis on track, I am going to look at this movie in the same order that we looked at the last one. So let's look at it as a comedy first. Right off the bat, this movie asserts its comedy tone by being based in grounded interpersonal interactions through a flirtatious interaction between the principal actor and his future wife. They introduce the actors in relative order of the comedy that they present throughout the film, from grounded up to the highest, kookiest camp, which I think does a lot for pulling you into the level of suspension of disbelief, from the groundedness on the streets of New Orleans at the beginning of the film to a ghost-infested, stretching, glowing haunted mansion that a lot of the movie takes place in. Tiffany Haddish, Owen Wilson, and Danny DeVito are all just firing on all cylinders here. I have to imagine that for these roles, the screenwriter knew who she was writing for, or at least made serious revisions to the script after the movie was cast. Because while the jokes are all just like well-timed and well-executed and create a common language of tone throughout the film, these comedy actors are being allowed to bring what they do best to the table. I will say there is one actor in the cast who I feel is being a bit wasted or just misused in this regard. So they cast Jamie Lee Curtis in the role of Madame Leota, and she's played basically straight the entire movie. There's something to be said both in favor and against this interpretation of Madame Leota, and we can probably get into that during the adaptation portion, but I do think that it's just kind of objectively a waste of Jamie Lee Curtis to have her playing straight just the whole film. We know that she has a wide acting range, including some comedy chops. I was just really excited when I saw this casting, and it just didn't meet my expectations. That being said, she does a perfectly serviceable job and is by no means dragging the film down. It just seemed like an odd choice to play her so straight, especially because they give her like one quick joke basically as soon as she appears on screen, and then no more jokes for the rest of the film. They do this great sequence of the film where they play with both kind of like making fun of / satirizing and also just indulging and having fun with the tropes of the heist film genre where they do the crew assembly bit. It's got just the right amount of bite to it for a 2023 film indulging in these things, and the pacing during this point in the film is really tight and snappy. It does a lot of the legwork to take the film from its Act 1, which, while being a bit long, never gets stale in my opinion, and helps transform the tone from this like grounded and ominous, if a bit campy at times, into the more chaotic sort of like mystery gang vibe that we get once all the principal characters are brought into the mansion. Which, in the context of the film, once you step into the mansion, you can't really leave the mansion for an extended period of time without like a cursed ghost following you and making your life miserable. So once you're in the mansion, you're part of the gang, you're part of the heist. The rest of the film carries itself through what could have otherwise been a pretty dry action horror plot if executed incorrectly, on the back of what are some honestly pretty standard comedy interactions and tropes. But that's okay. Not everything has to wildly innovate its genre. Scenes consistently move the plot forward while alternating between well-executed horror elements and having Tiffany Haddish, Danny DeVito, and Owen Wilson pass the joke torch around the room. They stuck to the basics but executed so well that there were times when I knew exactly what the punchline of a joke was gonna be, but the film got me to laugh anyways. A prime example of this is when they were looking for the secret hidden entrance to the seance room. Owen Wilson's character tries to pull a torch down like it's a secret lever, and it ends up just actually being a lever and he just yanks it off the wall. I saw it coming, but the staging, the sound mixing, the actors' deliveries sell it so well that it still got a gut reaction out of me anyways. I think it's pretty safe to say that my opinion of this film is that it does in fact succeed as a comedy. It establishes a consistent comedic tone and theming both throughout the film and isolated to each character. The humor never stops the plot from moving forward in a significant way, and is often used to establish a calm before the storm sense of ease that allows the horror moments to have more punch to them. I essentially have the same thing to say about the horror as I did about the comedy. It's not innovating the genre or anything, but it knows how to use the filmmaking tricks most common to the horror genre and execute on them in a really clean way that evokes the feelings from the viewer that it intends to. After moments of well-executed comedy, they use the score, lighting, and editing to kind of roller coaster you down from the warm and fuzzy feelings of a good wholesome laugh based on character relationships smoothly into horror and scares. They have this really sincere moment at one point where the main character reveals some pieces of his backstory and is just like acting his ass off. They transition this into a bonding moment between the characters before Danny DeVito cracks the sentimental tension with a joke that is just tonal whiplash enough to take us into a good comedy moment that works, but only because it feels in character for the character that they've established in the back half of the film. If they had tried to like do this kind of like tonal whiplash humor earlier in the film, or like hadn't done a good job establishing Danny DeVito's character, it wouldn't have worked, but they did, so it did. They then take us straight into one of the scariest moments of the film, which happens to also be a really great reference to the ride, which we'll get into later. It may sound like a contradiction in my film analysis that I'm kind of praising tonal whiplash here, where I tore it apart for the 2003 film, so let me explain that. Tonal whiplash is shocking. It pulls you out of whatever's going on and is unsettling. You can utilize the sense of discomfort brought on by a sudden contrast in tone to prime your audience to be scared by your horror, as feelings of fear and shock are generally unpleasant ones. Additionally, if your goal is to execute on a jump scare, you can make your jump scare a lot easier to execute on by effectively making sure that your audience is calm and focused on something else, therefore catching them off guard when the jump scare comes out. The film also does this at several points, which is executed on like perfectly adequately. There are two more qualities of this film that I think elevate its quality as a horror movie. One is that I think that they actually do a good job, or at least as good of a job as they can with a PG-13 Disney theatrical release, at making you feel as though maybe not all of the principal characters have plot armor. The lead character is yearning for the comfort of his deceased wife. Owen Wilson's character is portrayed as morally ambiguous enough that, a heroic sacrifice would work for the capping off of a redemption arc, and Tiffany Haddish's character is kind of in the same boat, but not nearly to the same degree. Danny DeVito's character, while well characterized, is predominantly comic relief, and there are some red herring pieces of foreshadowing throughout the film to make you think that he may actually be in some kind of mortal peril. The only characters that feel like they truly kind of have like plot armor are the owner of the house, Gabby, and her son, Travis. A lot of the theming of the movie and the forward momentum that the plot had would have felt like very moot if either of them had, got. So, they additionally establish very specific rules to govern the film about the afterlife and purgatory, which intersects with our mortal realm. In this case, the stakes of the movie are established to be that all of the spirits in the manor may be trapped in purgatory for eternity if our heroes fail, which seems to feel like a sort of functional like fate worse than death, and could at one point end up happening to Danny DeVito based on what's happening in the movie at that point. So, pretty high stakes, and it doesn't really feel like he has plot armor during that moment. Having well-established afterlife rules, including an at-peace rest as well as a purgatory, feels like it leaves the door open for a principal character to potentially die and get to either rest in peace, which is, maybe a fate better than death, or be able to be brought back due to a tangible and accessible in-between plane. The other quality of the film that I feel really elevates its quality as a horror film is the color palette. It can be difficult to truly establish feelings of fear or dread in a PG-13 movie, especially a Disney theatrical release. However, they allow themselves to steer out of a realistic color palette by leaning into our suspension of disbelief in the supernatural elements of the film, which they do a great job of instilling. They pull a lot of interesting color usages from the ride, like having ghosts be bright blues, the use of high contrasts and really bright whites or like highly saturated greens and purples to evoke cultural understandings of like ectoplasm and spectral presences established by movies like Ghostbusters and evoke feelings of magic and witchcraft exemplified in media, a la characters like Ursula, Maleficent, Dr. Facilier, Agatha Harkness from WandaVision, and Raven from Teen Titans. I could go on, but characters with like spooky, nefarious magic use purple and green magic. It's pretty well known. So they're using these highly saturated green and purple color palettes in moments of horror to evoke a more Halloween-y, cartoon, larger-than-life horror, just like the ride that they pulled these color palette choices from. I think you're getting the picture I'm painting of why this film works as a horror, So let's move on to the adaptation qualifier. Being an adaptation of the ride is where I feel like this film succeeds the most. I would even say I would give it a genuine full 10 out of 10 in this regard. Remember earlier when I said that there were two obvious routes that an adaptation could go in order to succeed in this regard? Either a strict retelling of the ride's story and lore as the plot for a feature-length film, or try and evoke the feeling of riding the ride through both references and qualitative elements. This film aims completely for the second, while incidentally kind of succeeding on the first one by not focusing so heavily on it as the 2003 attempt did. I know that's confusing, and I'm going to defend myself, but first I would like to establish my credentials in this regard. So I called myself a superfan earlier in the video, which is not like the entire truth. I happened to participate in something called the Disney College Program. The too long didn't read explanation of the Disney College Program is that Disney World utilizes their status as a major employer and an impressive brand name to get college students who love Disney to spend an entire semester in Florida being young, underpaid, overcompetent labor for the theme parks in exchange for getting their internship credits by getting to romp around Disney World. Honestly, it's great. Anyways, so I did this program twice. I had the time of my life. I wouldn't trade these periods of time in my life for anything. On my second program, I met my partner of 6 years, so the program has its problems, but that's a whole different video. So I had to cut like a massive portion of this script where I just went on a huge tangent about the Disney College Program, and it had to go. All right, so working at Disney, you basically get unfettered access to the parks. Magic Kingdom is my favorite park, and the Haunted Mansion is a favorite attraction for me, definitely top 5. And I'm a person who doesn't mind hot weather and is okay spending time at a theme park by myself. This means that I would often spend days off or time before or after work in the parks at slow times of the day or just slow seasons, riding and re-riding my favorite attractions. I would say that I'm at least in like the top like 90th percentile in how many times I've experienced the Haunted Mansion. So I feel very well versed to explain this part of the topic. All right, so this movie is absolutely stuffed with references, nods, aesthetics, lines, and scenes from the ride. I know that's something that I said about the 2003 film that didn't work for me, and I don't want to simply contextualize why the 2023 one did work based simply in contrast to how much the earlier one doesn't, but just remember that my core complaint about the aspects of adapting in that 2003 film were that they were always an interruption that ground the movie to a halt and worsened its already dismal tone and pacing problems, and that they usually missed the point of having the reference to begin with. So the 2023 film works the ride into the film, in my opinion, nearly flawlessly. The first way in which the movie does this happens from the very first moment and continues throughout the movie. The film opens with an instrumental cover of the iconic song from the Singing Ghost Busts towards the end of the attraction, Grim Grinning Ghosts. They use this to implicitly tell you right off the bat that you are in for a love letter to the ride. But they continue forward with the beginning of the film, fading the music out as soon as it would intrude on the scene and playing it at a volume that is not obtrusive. They actually use different versions of Grim Grinning Ghosts all throughout the film, changing the arrangement, sometimes using it as a full backing track and sometimes just using it as a leitmotif. Most of the rest of the music, while not lifted directly from the ride, follows a very similar affectation to the music from the ride by employing a similar selection of instruments and stylization of those instruments. Not only do I think that the highly saturated color palette for the supernatural elements really helps to serve the kooky horror aspects, which is a tone for the horror which is lifted from specific portions all over the ride. Not only is the color palette lifted from the ride, but specifically a lot of patterns, images, and even rooms and scenes are lifted straight from the ride. The thing that's great about this, though, is that they use this as an active and engaging backdrop for a movie with a well-paced plot that is constantly moving forward, and only bring these things to the foreground when they are relevant to what is happening with the characters in the story. A small example of this is that the wallpaper in a lot of the places in the house is the same purple and black pattern with the hidden moving eyes all throughout it. So this is mostly a world building and tone building thing, but it is given a few quick pauses by the camera where it helps to build a sense of foreboding. A bigger example of this is the stretching room from the prelude to the ride. It's possible that this scene is the most iconic part of the ride, and they spend a lot of time throughout the film in this location. It's a space in the house where the ghosts are less active, so it serves as a backdrop for a lot of exposition and planning scenes. It also helps that it's a really interesting space. It's got a lot of ornate furniture, it's got this octagonal shape to it, this gaudy, really saturated red and gold wallpaper which serves to vary up the color palette. They use this room so often throughout the film that we grow to think of it as a safe base, a place where the mansion can't fuck with them. Then, at a late point in the film, we get a recreation of the stretching room scene from the attraction. It's great because it acts as an extra sense of horror because it's a cinematic reimagining of an unsettling scene that a lot of us have experienced in person before because of the attraction, but set in a room that we've grown to think that the characters are safe in throughout this film. Additionally, it serves as an action escape scene where the characters were already on their way out of the house to try and further the plot, so we basically get a full recreation of one of the most famous scenes from the ride without grinding the plot to a halt. It just gives the characters an additional obstacle to overcome on the way to where they were already going. More obstacles in a character's way isn't the same thing as grinding the plot to a halt, because an obstacle is a thing that can be overcome and make the heroes winning in the end feel more earned and feel more satisfying as a viewer. Some other things that I liked include Tiffany Haddish's character gets launched from the seance room by a ghost on a chair at one point that glides her smoothly all the way across the floor and out the front door of the mansion, and the chair is pretty distinctly shaped like one of the doom buggies from the ride. They do a visual reference during one of the scenes where the mansion is throwing unsettling things at the characters, where they emulate the candle floating at the end of a long dark hallway scene from the attraction. There are a series of paintings and photographs that are direct references and recreations of the paintings that are in the ride and act like a lenticular poster when lightning strikes. One of them even houses a ghost that follows the main character out of the mansion for a time and helps them resolve the plot at the end of the movie. All of the paintings from the stretching room are actually in the stretching room as well and sort of like come to life and interact with the characters during a very plot-heavy moment. I could go on and on and on about these references, but they were omnipresent and well-executed fan service and love letters to the attraction. But, in my opinion, they were never obtrusive, mostly used as backdrops or fun details to place around the film to build suspense and spookiness, only being brought to the foreground or taking up notable screen time when they are able to be worked into forwarding the plot or building the world that the characters are in to be better fleshed out. Now, the way I'm describing this, I'm sure that you're going to say, but Spooky Snacks, how does this possibly succeed as an adaptation of the ride by adapting the lore of the ride into a full-blown story? If it's almost all unobtrusive background pieces, how does that make up the plot? And don't you worry, I've got an answer for you. If you pay attention during the ride, the actual ride itself, specifically the narration of the ghost host, makes a point of touring you through the mansion and basically trying to sell you on the idea that it's the place to be, right? So there's this famous line from the ride. Actually, we have 999 happy haunts here, but there's room for 1,000. Any volunteers? This implies that the whole reason that the ghost host is taking you through the mansion like this is to try and round out his numbers to 1,000 ghosts. The Hatbox Ghost, who is a character that was removed from the ride shortly after its debut and therefore wasn't given a deep external canon in the Ghost Gallery, is the primary villain of the film. He is therefore able to be written into a fully formed villain without having to either conform to or contradict anything from the ride or from the Ghost Gallery. The primary plot of the film is that the Hatbox Ghost has trapped 999 spirits in the mansion and has convinced them that the way for them to all rest in peace is for him to round out his numbers to 1,000, but that 1,000th soul has to be willing. This is a perfect way to build a full plot that reflects both the feeling and the literal text of the attraction. It doesn't get dragged down by a ton of lore and character-specific details, a lot of which aren't even actual canon things from the ride, they're just well-accepted fan canon. This way you don't end up accidentally angering a huge portion of what your target demographic might be for this movie, people who really love the ride, and therefore are probably really into the Ghost Gallery stuff, because then they'd just rip it to shreds on the internet. The primary experience and narrative of the attraction for the average rider is that you've stumbled into a haunted mansion where the ghost is trying to get you to willingly join them on their ghostly plane, and you need to find a way out. They filled out all of the rest of the details of the plot and built a great story with engaging characters to fill out that plot, and this is how they managed to succeed on both of my designated obvious paths for a successful adaptation of the ride. Now on to the fourth metric of the success of a horror comedy film adaptation of The Haunted Mansion, that being its merit as a film in and of itself. I think that much like with the 2003 film, my answer here is obvious. I do believe that The Haunted Mansion 2023 not only did a significantly better job than its predecessor at being a competent film with solid filmmaking and storytelling, but that it stands extremely well on its own as a well-made horror, comedy, film, and adaptation of the ride. When any hype about this film has died down, my opinion is that the general reception will have been overall positive and that the 2003 film will go down as a laughable footnote. That being said, I want to be clear about this. I don't think that this movie is something revolutionary or that it's a full 10 out of 10. Earlier I said that as an adaptation of an attraction, it scores that way for me. But in its other aspects, I think it ranges from perfectly serviceable to pretty damn good. Like I said, in both its comedy and horror aspects, it relies on tried and true joke structures and filmmaking tricks to a degree where you can pretty often see what's coming and how it's going to come, but they instead focused on great execution rather than trying to revolutionize their genres, and it works well for them. In the interest of fairness, I will give a couple critiques here. The climax of this film became very trite and overly sincere, as you can feel the writer and the editors kind of lose confidence in how to wrap up the film in a Disney appropriate way. The rest of the film, while being a bit predictable and cliche, has a very 2023 self-aware sort of biting humor to it. So the ending does feel a bit tonally dissonant in this regard, and I do mean tonally dissonant in a bad way this time. However, they spend about 5 or 10 minutes or so in this surprisingly earnest tone to settle up the primary conflicts of the film, and then get back to the tone that led the rest of the film to present a pretty enjoyable ending sequence. Part 5. Rest in Peace. So I guess the principal question of all of this is, do I think it was worth it to revisit the concept of adapting this ride into a movie after 20 years? And that's actually really hard to answer for me, surprisingly enough. So while the 2003 film is an abysmal embarrassment, a waste of effort, talent, and $90 million, I don't know that the concept of adapting theme park rides into movies is a great idea to begin with. It worked out really well with Pirates of the Caribbean, but I'm pretty sure Pirates were kind of in around then, or at least not out. And they basically said, who the fuck cares about the actual content or aesthetic of this ride, and just took the name and the literal interpretation of the concept of pirates who are of the Caribbean, and just proceeded to make a really good movie.
Why is the rum gone?
I don't want to show all my cards here or maybe make this whole video feel more disingenuous, but I actually wrote a good portion of this script before the 2023 film came out, knowing that I would just adjust the back half of the script according to whether or not the movie was bad. And honestly, time will tell if my assessment here is even a good take. Thus far, the general consensus at least appears to be that while the 2023 film was better than the 2003 film, the Rotten Tomatoes page so far indicates that that might be the best response that it could hope for. It is really notable for me that there is such a massive discrepancy between critical reception and audience reception for this film. It's currently got a 39% on critic reviews, which is pretty rough and a very definitive splat about a week after the movie comes out, but an 84% from the audience. And I have a few potential explanations for why this is happening, minding that I have only read/skimmed a lot of the reviews, just not every single one. So one of my explanations is that viewers and reviewers went into this movie for really different reasons. Viewers went in hoping that this would be better than the 2003 attempt, maybe with really fond memories of the ride. Maybe they were kids or teens when the other film adaptation came out, and maybe they're even parents taking their kids to the theater now. That is all to say that they went into the theater prepared to have a good time. I fear that the reviewers maybe went to the theater for a different reason. A concept explored in a recent video about Guy Fieri by YouTube legend Lindsay Ellis brings up how the popular review about Guy Fieri's Times Square restaurant was a well-timed takedown piece designed to invite contempt and outrage and, more importantly, garner clout by capitalizing on people's more sadistic tendencies to uncritically consume bad content with a sharp, if completely unfounded, review. I highly recommend this video, by the way. Great watch. I'm pretty sure it's just on Nebula because I'm pretty sure she's just done with YouTube now, so I will put the link down below. This review seriously made the rounds and got this guy a lot of clout, and I think that that's what a lot of these reviewers went in here hoping to do. Outrage and ridicule get views and engagement. either from people who want to join in the jeering mob or people who want to argue with the harsh critical review. So think about it. How juicy would it be if this movie was bad? Disney completely flops on their attempt in 2003, comes back 20 years later to take another swing at it, and manages to mess it up again. The absolute tea, the drama of it all, the spicy review that you could write would, maybe get you a lot of clout. And in my opinion, I think that some of the reviewers may have read that into this film. I mean, if you don't believe me, just go start looking at a lot of the splat reviews. Matthew Jackson of The Item says, "Magic was always going to be hard. We know this because we've been on the ride, but we also know it because Disney already made a Haunted Mansion movie 20 years ago, and it's not all that warmly remembered. So, does it all work? It's a valiant effort, but despite everyone working well within the confines of the material and a few charming moments, it's a movie that ultimately falls just a little flat. All the ingredients are there for a good time. Sometimes a movie gives it everything it has and still can't get to the finish line, and Haunted Mansion, sadly, feels like one of those films." This reviewer can't even find anything bad to say about the movie. They just wanted it to be bad so they could execute the premise of their review. The worst thing that they have to say about it is it falls a little flat. Nick Johnston of Vanyaland says, "But that hasn't stopped them from trying once a new group of Disney brass takes up the corner office and tries to find a new source of intellectual property to mine. How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old mouse?" Alright, that SpongeBob reference was good. But after unnecessarily roasting the 2003 film to preface his review, which, by the way, I would just like to point out that I roasted the 2003 film as a framing device, nothing unnecessary happened. Alright, so the actual content of the rest of his review achingly tries to find something bad to say about the movie, but can't muster anything besides, "There's potential here, but it didn't work," while delivering it a splat rating and a review title of Haunted Mansion Review, "The Mouse Smothers the House." Obviously a mean-spirited clickbait title. I'm not gonna keep going through these reviews, but it's fairly consistent throughout the splat reviews that I read. They roast the 2003 film, and then they write a snarky bad faith recap of the 2023 one, and then fail to justify with any kind of citation why, in spite of being generally good, the 2023 one is just also bad. Now, that is the charitable interpretation of how we got such a splat rating with a generally positive rating from the audience. There is, however, a less charitable interpretation of how we got here, and I am not, unfortunately, the person to answer this question. I do, however, feel comfortable posing the question. In my opinion, a lot of the humor of 2023's Haunted Mansion is very culturally black. This isn't a good thing or a bad thing inherently, just an observation. I guess it's a good thing for representation, but otherwise it's a mostly neutral observation. I thought, from my limited, privileged perspective, that these elements were well executed and felt genuinely delivered and non-tokenizing. I think that this is well supported by the fact that the screenwriter is known for being representation foot forward from the female Ghostbusters reboot, and that the composer, Chris Bowers, and director, Justin Simeon, are best known for their work on Dear White People, a destructive and progressive Netflix series that broke headlines for uplifting Black voices and asking hard questions about racism in modern America to a wide audience back in 2014 around the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, I am not saying that this is what happened, but most of the splat reviews, including the ones I cited earlier, seem to be written by white people, particularly white men. On the flip side, I see a lot more women, LGBTQ folks, and most importantly, POC when I look at the fresh reviews. Is it possible that this fun and proudly Black Disney romp was so poorly received by critics because film critics are overwhelmingly white men, and that the movie possibly just wasn't made exclusively with their sensibilities in mind, and that the general public is far less skewed population-wise and might be more interested in seeing something with that kind of representation? I don't really feel comfortable doing more than posing the question and kind of providing the information. Honestly, if I had to take a stab, I would actually think that it was a mixture of these two explanations and maybe some other things that I haven't noticed or haven't thought about. If you're another creator watching this video who's more equipped to take this on, I really encourage you to shoot me a link when you're done because I'd love to watch it. And if you're just a viewer who feels more prepared to take this on, I would love to hear from you in the comments. All in all, I had a great time in the theater, and I think that it's really easy to lose sight of the fact that that's really the point of a lot of pop culture media, right? And Haunted Mansion, in spite of putting its best foot forward with representation and also telling a competent and coherent story in a compelling way, is in fact, like, definitely a popcorn flick, right? It's meant to rake in box office money, not to win awards. And while I do think that this movie could possibly warrant some nominations for direction and composing and definitely holds artistic merit, no doubt, I don't think that this was the main reason that this movie was bankrolled. If the Rotten Tomatoes page can tell us anything, it is that movie critics seem to have, as a profession, lost the plot on how to assess whether or not an audience will enjoy a film. And isn't that the point of a news outlet / blog reviewer? To give its viewers, who are ideally a group of people who share some kind of commonality as readers of that news source, an impression as to whether or not they would like to view that movie. With a discrepancy this wide between audience perspective and critic reception that I definitely seem to be on the audience side of, I think it's worth it to assess how much value these critics even provide to the film world if they're not a good indication of audience reaction anymore. While these are excellent questions worth asking, this script has truly gotten away from me, so let's get back on topic. So the topic is, do I think it was worth bringing the Haunted Mansion back from its cinematic grave for another ghostly go as a film adaptation? In hindsight, yes. I loved this movie, I'm glad it exists, I had a great theater experience, and I'll probably give it a rewatch sometime around some Halloween or after visiting the attraction again. However, if I had been the person to have to greenlight the pitch or not, I'm not sure. If I was a studio executive trying to hedge my business bets, maybe not. But I love the attraction, and I've always thought it was a shame that the 2003 film was so rough, so personally, without considering the business or money of it all, another attempt at this would have gotten a ghoulishly green light from me. Alright, I'm tired and I want to take this makeup off. I don't know if you can tell, but I have been sweating in here. I'm filming in a garage today. I'm still trying to build this channel up, so please take the time to like, subscribe, and comment on this video if you feel any kind of positive way about it. And I mean, honestly, go ahead and comment if you feel some type of negative way about it, because engagement is engagement. We just talked about it. I'm just starting out and I need support from viewers like you. And remember, there's less than 100 happy subscribers, but there's always room for 1,000. Yeah.
Trespassers don't get cookies.